You guys don't know how excited I am that I finally have a reason to make this video. I mean, yeah, it's a problem and has been a problem since the release of the Tools of Torment chapter, but it actually feels like something will be done about it this time. Let me start fresh. I was working on a longer video, and I'm currently in the scripting process of writing it, but I felt like this was a way more important thing to talk about. That video will come out whenever it does. It's a big project, and I wanted it to be my debut into making videos again. But it can wait. I don't really want to rush it, it's very important to me, and frankly I want it to feel like an important video. I even had a section in that video where I talked about Skull Merchant and a few of the problems I have with her, but I feel like this will be a way more natural way to do it in this video. Not only is it a hot topic now, but it's a good reason I can finally get some stuff off my chest. I want to be able to discuss this before the conversation dies down, so I can say my piece about it without it feeling out of place or I guess weird. On top of that, maybe an extra voice in the crowd will make the whole thing seem a bit more impactful or important. This will all be hilarious if I can't get this video released in a timely manner, but I'm choosing to roll with it anyway. So I'll give you the brief rundown for anyone that doesn't know. A Skull Merchant player named CM9I made a somewhat troll post. I'm still not sure, but by the wording of the post I kind of assumed it was, saying that playing Skull Merchant as a chase killer is useless, and she should solely be used as an area defense killer if you want to win matches, while showing a screenshot of him beating a team with all brand new parts. He also compared playing 3-gen Skull Merchant to a game of chess, which is honestly pretty damn hilarious. Now, I think this post was obvious bait to get a reaction out of people, which it kind of did. However, this conversation didn't really take off until CM9I made what I guess you'd say is a call-out post towards a really good DBD player named Nightlight. Now, Knight is a player for a competitive Dead by Daylight team named Eternal, who are highly regarded by most people as probably the best DBD team out there. This call-out post just showed Knight losing 2 times in a row against random survivors, which I guess was supposed to be an insult because he's really good at the game. Anyway, Knight replied, and there's a little bit of back and forth between the two, which was basically just bickering. However, the conversation turned towards CM9I, claiming that Knight and his entire team would lose in a private match against his Skull Merchant. Knight kind of blew CM off, but I guess it didn't last long because they actually ended up playing a match. Knight and Eternal knew what they were going up against, and knowing they'd be facing a 3-gen Skull Merchant, they planned pretty appropriately. They brought in perks like Potential Energy, Resilience, and Circle of Healing to hopefully make gens go just a little bit faster. In turn, CM9I was allowed to pick the map, and he ended up choosing Torment Creek, which, if you don't know, is part of the Coldman maps. Now, CM9I knew he couldn't win by chasing and hooking the survivors, so instead he cooked up a much more devious scheme. In public lobbies, Dead by Daylight matches can only last up to an hour, and after which the server shuts down and all survivors are kind of declared dead by the game. CM figured that if he could make the game last an hour, the servers would shut down, and if the survivors hadn't escaped at that point, he would win by default. What followed was a 55-minute match of Dead by Daylight with one of, if not the best survivor team in the world. As a result of this being covered by big DBD content creators like Otts and Hens, a conversation started about Skull Merchant's place in Dead by Daylight and if she needed changes or not. Of course, as someone who's been playing this game for a long time, I immediately had a take on it. As for the, I don't know, I guess you'd call it drama, it was obviously bait. Well, I'm not sure what CM9I was looking for, whether it was clout, entertainment, or replies, it really doesn't matter. Based on the wording of what CM posted, you can tell there's a lot of irony in there. Then again, I mean, the DBD community does tend to surprise me with the stupidity that sometimes rears its ugly head. Regardless, the drama doesn't really have anything to do with why this is such a hot topic right now. It has almost everything to do with the actual match they played. An hour-long game is nothing new. People have been doing stupid shit like that for years at this point. Hell, even Hens held the game hostage for that long as Knight during the whole Eruption meta. What made this one different, however, was Eternal. Eternal is a team with very good survivors. Survivors who all know what they're doing and how they're going to do it. The fact that these survivors who were all, in medical terms, cracked, were able to be kept at a standstill for 50+ minutes should be incredibly worrisome to anyone who plays Survivor. If a god tier 4-man Survive with friends on comms was barely able to make it out of a match in under an hour, imagine if the same tactic was applied to solo queue. Now, the question is, why is this a Skull Merchant problem? If Hens could hold a game hostage with the Knight for roughly as long, isn't it more of a Dead by Daylight problem? Do you mind if we have a little history lesson here? A little trip down memory lane if we could? Do you guys remember the old Eruption? No, not old Eruption, old Eruption. You know, pre-nerf Eruption. For those that are blissfully unaware, with the release of the first Resident Evil chapter, a perk for Nemesis called Eruption came out. On release, this perk was pretty dog water. There was no real reason to run it over any other gen regression perk in the game, and the perk was pretty simple, but I still thought it wasn't terribly designed for what it was. How the perk worked was every time you kicked the generator, that gen would be highlighted in yellow. When a survivor was put into the dying state, all the generators you kicked would explode and regress their progress by 6%. After the perk activated, the gens would no longer be affected by the perk until you kick them again with the perk active. Sounds pretty basic, right? Well, not only did this perk regress the generator, but any survivors repairing a highlighted generator would become incapacitated for 16 seconds. Now, the incapacitated status effect is a really bad one. This status effect was introduced with the twins, of course, and was applied when Victor pounced on you. I always thought it was weird that he applied a status effect, but I guess it makes sense in hindsight knowing they probably always planned it to be used on perks. Anyway, the incapacitated status effect makes it so survivors can't really do anything. Like, at all. Sure, you can perform smaller actions like unhooking survivors and stuff along those lines, but all major actions such as repairing generators, healing other survivors and yourself, cleansing totems, were all inaccessible for as long as you were afflicted with the effect. Eruption applying 16 seconds of this effect sounds crazy good, but evidently it wasn't enough for people to run it because the stats for this perk were really low. Behavior, being the statistic Andes they are, decide to give the perk a buff, and oof, buff it they definitely did. The changes they made were simple number changes. They changed the 6% regression on activation to a 10% regression, which isn't too big, but nice I guess. They also increased the duration of the incapacitated status effect from 16 seconds to a small 25 seconds. I genuinely don't know who thought this was a good idea. This single change made Eruption a meta perk overnight, and people quickly started realizing just how powerful the perk was. It became a perk that everyone was running when playing Killer. On every killer, in every build, you'd be seeing Eruption. It was absolute mayhem. Now, what made this perk so damn annoying was the fact that, unless you're in a 4-man survive with friends, there was no real counterplay to it. You were never able to accurately gauge when a survivor would go down and set off Eruption. You could make an educated guess, sure, but you could never know exactly when it would happen. Would this survivor last 5 seconds in chase? 10 seconds maybe? They might last 30 seconds or 45. Unless you had a teammate directly tell you when they're about to go down, it was all just blind luck. This, combined with other reasons, made the perk absolutely infuriating to go against. You may be wondering at this point, Scrump, what does this have anything to do with Skull Merchant? You know, the whole reason you made this video in the first place. Well, what the Eruption buff did was turn every killer into a 3-gen master. Now, Eruption is activated globally. This means that all generators on the map that you kick get affected. So you're probably wondering why this helps with 3-gen specifically if it works no matter where you are. For those people that commit to 3-gens, you'll know you don't tend to get downs very often. You just hit a survivor if they get too close and go back to the generators. However, with the existence of buffed Eruption, you could actually go for that second hit. Leaving a 3-gen was always a risky choice, because if you were too far away, you wouldn't be able to make it back in time before one of the generators popped. But the second Eruption was changed, you were no longer hurt by going for a down on a survivor. Not only a 10% regression penalty, but 25 seconds of nothing being done if the survivors weren't able to avoid Eruption. Due to this, the ability to hold a 3-gen by remotely detonating the generators was crazy good and crazy annoying. For the first time, you didn't have to be guarding the generators manually. I won't even get started on how strong pairing Eruption up with other gen regression perks like Hall of Brine or Overcharge was. It was genuinely difficult to play Dead by Daylight around this time. Every killer was running a build with Eruption, and even when playing with friends, it was still very hard to deal with. People were incredibly outspoken about how awful this perk was for the health of the game, but for a while, it stayed the way it was. I mean, sure, gen kicking perks like Pop Goes the Weasel had always existed, but the difference was that pretty much every other gen regression perk up until buffed Eruption was actually manageable. With the incentive to kick generators because of Eruption and strong combos with it, almost every time a chase would start, the killer would stop to kick whatever gen you were working on before chasing, which got so old so quickly. The gen kick meta, and especially the stronger 3-gen strategy, was indescribably bad for the game, and so easy for the killer that it was actually making players worse at Dead by Daylight. This terrible meta stayed for a long ass time too. But After what felt like decades of complaining and agony, Eruption was finally nerfed. For the first time, it felt like the 3-gen issue was finally done and over with. There's a catch though. The update that finally gave us the nerf to Eruption that we have been looking forward to for such a long time gave us something that almost seemed to replace it. The Skull Merchant. When the Skull Merchant came out, she was immediately loathed by most of the community. Not because she was too strong or her power was too good in chase, quite the opposite actually. The Skull Merchant's power felt like it was designed for the exact same strategy that people had been complaining about for the entire time that Eruption was buffed. What made Eruption so good? The fact that you could technically camp generators without being near them and prevent survivors from even being able to work on them. Skull Merchant, by the design of her power, does the exact same thing. Call me a conspiracy theorist, but I have a suspicion that Skull Merchant was supposed to be a completely different killer at some point. I mean, I doubt it was supposed to be a chapter for the Predator franchise or whatever the hell people were saying back when she came out, but I can't blame them for thinking that. Everything about Tools of Torment just felt so weird. The fact that we got 2 survivors for a chapter that was original, despite that only happening for licensed characters, the way that Skull Merchant clashes so hard with her characterization because of her gameplay, the choice to make drones, robots that are kind of known for flying around, stay stationary in one place. Everything just felt so odd. I'd say the Singularity has a power that makes more sense with the Skull Merchant than the power she actually has. A killer with the power of setting up small devices that you can shoot survivors with makes a lot more sense with a character that has drones. This chapter just felt all over the place. Everything about the killer clashed so hard, and I'm still scratching my head trying to figure out why. In my personal opinion, the Skull Merchant kind of feels like damage control. Some players really liked Eruption, and nerfing it as hard as they did definitely upset a lot of them. People were basically relying on it to win them games, and while that's by definition a skill issue, I'm sure Behavior was probably at least a little worried that those players would quit the game when the perk got nerfed. I don't know, maybe Skull Merchant had some changes made around the time they realized they needed to nerf Eruption. I'm not sure, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. Anyway, back to the question of how is this a Skull Merchant problem? Well, all my talk about Eruption wasn't for nothing. Before Eruption, 3-gen strategies weren't nearly as big of an issue. They were more seen as a last resort than anything else. I mean, yeah, occasionally you'd get maps that actively pushed you towards that playstyle, or survivors would be unaware of what gens were being done and end up putting themselves in that situation by accident. Because of Eruption, you had people start matches and immediately start picking a 3-gen. Players had done this before, but Eruption and the gen kick meta in general made it so much bigger of an issue. Any way that a 3-gen strategy ended up happening was usually just unintentional design. Things like Azerov's resting place, pre-rework Doctor, survivors doing it to themselves, were all random circumstances that resulted in a really boring strategy. Hell, even Eruption wasn't meant to be used that way. It was just a perk that happened to be effective in those particular instances. This brings us to Skull Merchant. Skull Merchant was made to camp generators. She was also one of Behavior's only examples of promoting 3-gen strategies. Whether it was intentional or not, that's what she excels at, and not playing her in that way is actively making the game more difficult for you. I love to give Behavior the benefit of the doubt here, but I just have a hard time picturing them accidentally making a killer this annoying. See, with killers like the Knight, it's more understandable. You can make more excuses for the Knight and his potential to camp generators because, while he's poorly designed, the guards aren't permanent and you can easily bait one away. The Skull Merchant, on the other hand, lacks any sort of hard counter to her ability to camp generators. Not only can she set up drones and activate them anywhere on the map, she can constantly keep recalling her drones and setting them back up with no issues. You can disarm them, but since she can replace them so quickly, it's almost worth it to just get exposed while working on the generator. While the drones are active, there's about nothing you can do except wait outside of the drone's range and wait for it to enter scouting mode, but that wastes so much time on top of the time already being wasted. While you could just say, suck it up and stay exposed while working on the generator, that argument just completely misses the point of what makes her so annoying. Not only can she clearly see when a survivor is in the radius of any drone, she can also instantly down you if you spend too long in the radius, making it so the first hit that other killers using 3-gens get is actually an insta-down, and adds the insane amount of pressure she has. The smart choice is obviously just to run early so she can't get close enough, but that's why the games last so damn long all the time. Every now and then, I'll see a post on my Twitter timeline, and no, I'm not calling it X, it's a dumb name and I'm never using it. Showing someone dropping a drone in chase, and then downing a survivor because they're either hindered or the merchant has haste. These posts are usually from people trying to convince everyone that Skull Merchant has some sort of chase potential that people are just absolutely ignoring. Of course, the only way this ends up happening is with either using a purple add-on, or if some survivor somewhere on the map is being tracked. Now, using the add-ons as an argument for her having chase potential is easy to counter. It's very simple. If you need add-ons to catch a survivor in chase, that doesn't mean the killer has good chase potential. If I run Alchemist Ring on Blight and get a 4K, that doesn't mean I'm a god tier Blight. I'm just relying on my add-ons to do the heavy lifting. Also, it's super boring. You just press M2 and set up a drone facing no real punishment, and then boom, you're able to catch the survivor just a little bit quicker. I wouldn't really consider that chase potential. Another argument people might try to make would include the haste she gets when a survivor is being tracked. A little bit ago, if you don't know, Skull Merchant was buffed by behavior to try to make her less of a miserable killer to face. These changes weren't terrible, but they obviously weren't enough to make her fun to go against because of the aforementioned 55-minute game of Dead by Daylight. Some of these changes included making it so she gets more movement speed when a survivor is carrying a tracker, or a claw trap. Any survivor with a tracker breaks a pallet when vaulting it, and drones become unhackable when a survivor with a tracker is near. You might notice that all these changes have to do with the survivor being tracked, I guess with the intent of making it so the survivors are punished for deactivating drones? But why the hell would you buff her that way? If the intent was to make her less annoying with holding generators, which they flat out stated was the purpose, why would you punish the survivors for deactivating the drones? I mean, I guess they did nerf her by making it so the drones would only return to the merchant after their respective trackers were disarmed, which I guess was to change it so anyone playing the merchant wouldn't try to reactivate the drone every time it entered scouting mode, but that still doesn't fix the issue. Why would someone playing the Skull Merchant, a killer who is basically known for her ability to hold generators, choose not to play her in the most effective way? In the situation of a 3-gen, it's unlikely that a survivor would be able to disarm a drone anyway because of them usually being active. And even if they did, she has 4 drones, not 3. This means that even if a survivor had the ability to disarm a drone, she'd just replace it really quickly. You can even set up some cheeky spots on maps because the drones travel through floors, which can make it even more difficult to disarm them. These buffs didn't solve the issue, they just continued to highlight her biggest problem. The most annoying part of this whole thing is that anyone who wants to play the Skull Merchant in a fun way just can't. What else would be an effective way to use her drones other than to camp generators? Place them at loops ahead of time? I guess you could do that, but you'd have no information on the rest of the map, and survivors would just ignore the loop and run somewhere else. Place them at pallets or windows during a chase? I guess you could do that too, but if the survivor is healthy, they just pre-drop the pallet or leave the loop to avoid getting exposed, which, if you're in a good spot, would at least land you a hit, but would be absolutely useless if the survivor was injured. Even if the survivor has a claw trap on them, you'd still run into the same issue where you'd just be dealing with pre-drops and someone holding W, which is one of the most boring parts of Dead by Daylight. While I understand what the idea was with the trackers, it doesn't prevent Skull Merchant players from using the most mind-numbing strategy in the whole game. Long story short, this leaves the only people playing Skull Merchant the ones who want to hold generators and, in most scenarios, using 3-gen strategies to win. You want a killer who dominates in chase and can spread pressure like crazy? There's already 20 different killers for that. You could play Wesker, Hillbilly, Huntress. There's so many other killers you could pick for that playstyle. And of course, a variety of different killers with different playstyles is great, but having one that does really well with such a boring tactic is a terrible idea. Skull Merchant is so bad that by using any method other than 3-gens to win, you're basically saying you don't want to win the game, and losing never feels good. The Skull Merchant is a fundamentally flawed killer. Everything about her power and general gameplay design was very poorly thought out and put together. Do I think she was designed with generator holding and 3-gen strategies in mind? Well, I'd like to say no, but then again she has a few add-ons that affect skill checks, so I'm not sure. I'd love to think Behavior didn't know this would be an issue, but I also feel like it would be an insult to their intelligence to assume otherwise. I've looked at this from as many angles as I can from every single direction, and I can't come to a different conclusion than I did the moment she was revealed. The Skull Merchant is a failure. She's a failure from her power to the very way she's presented in the game. Drones that do nothing but stay in one place. A killer with a design and lore akin to a predator or hunter type with gameplay that promotes protecting a single area. A killer that relies on add-ons and rare circumstances to provide any real lethality. A killer that's so bad that her only chance of winning is to use the most boring and time-consuming strategy in Dead by Daylight history. You can't even really blame the people doing it. Well, I guess you can, but it's the only way to reliably win against even mediocre survivors. She excels at holding generators, but basically nothing else. The way she's played by most people now is a direct result of the eruption meta and the constant rewarding of people playing in the most boring way. She's a killer that only benefits the players who want everyone else in the match to have a miserable and drawn out game. Now, does this mean that people who play her should be picked on and bullied? Of course not, it's a goddamn video game. However, those people who play her can't throw a fit every time people choose to leave the game by disconnecting or choose not to play. I feel like the Skull Merchant players should know what they're signing up for by now. People simply don't want to spend 30 minutes in a match trying to break a 3-gen, which is the most common way people play her, and sort of need to if they care about winning. I'd honestly say that Skull Merchant, as she stands right now, is the biggest failure in terms of design concept that Behavior has ever made. I know that's a pretty bold statement to make, but I feel like there's a viable excuse for every other killer. Many people would probably consider Old Legion to be the worst in terms of design, but they were never meant to be played in the way that made them so hated. The Legion was created as a killer who specialized in spreading a ton of pressure on the map, not as a killer who could bully a single survivor. However, when Old Legion was released, people quickly realized that you could cheese the deep wound timer by moonwalking and just continue to force the survivor closer and closer to death with no counterplay. It's pretty obvious that Behavior didn't think about this, and they fixed it pretty quickly. The worst part is, even when the strategy existed, the Legion still wasn't good. While the Legion would be forcing someone to bleed out due to deep wound, everyone else would just be working on generators. It was a bad strategy, but people used it because it was so fucking annoying and people love being annoying. They were badly designed, sure, but there was a good concept mixed in there. Nurse is also considered to be badly designed, which is very true. Nurse doesn't have to play DBD, she just goes through everything and you have to do your best to predict where she'll go. She's pretty awful to face, but you also have to think about when she came out. Nurse was from the first chapter ever made for DBD, which was The Last Breath. During this point, Behavior had little to no clue what their plan for the game was, and they were clearly not worried about the balance. Nurse was terribly balanced, but so was everything else at that point. There's no excuse for her being the way she is now, but once again, she actually has a solid design concept, and with a lot of changes, she might be a really fun killer to face someday. Spirit was incredibly bad on her PTB, but was buffed and then became really annoying and basically uncounterable. However, a killer that becomes blind when using their power and has to rely on things like sound cues is also a pretty awesome idea. Once again, the idea is there, but the design isn't. Same for the Knight, same for the Trickster, same for the Hag, and same for the Twins. However, the idea for Skull Merchant just isn't there like the rest of the killers. She's a killer that only specializes in guarding generators, and that's it. That's all her design is. I'll try not to regurgitate the points I've already made, but playing her any other way is pointless. As much as CM9I's post was bait, he did make one point I agree with. Playing the Skull Merchant as a chase killer is useless if you want to win games. This brings us back to Eternal and CM9I's private match. CM9I had the choice of any map he wanted to play on, and while there are a lot of maps you can 3-gen on, he picked Torment Creek. This immediately made me raise an eyebrow because I would never have considered Torment Creek a 3-gen map, and especially a good map for Skull Merchant. But evidently, he knew something I didn't because he got a pretty nasty generator setup. Not only did he get that, but he also used an offering to make the basement spawn in the main building, which you can set a drone in to make it as to where the survivors have to go to the basement to disarm the drone. I had no idea you could do that, and was actually kind of impressed. That, of course, didn't last long. The basement drone play was about the only moment in the entire 55-minute match that impressed me. The rest of it was boring as fuck. CM9I picked his 3-gen from the start, and thanks to the Skull Merchant being designed the way she is, Eternal wasn't able to do much in regards to stopping her from keeping it. Every single chance CM9I got, he'd activate the drone so Eternal couldn't disarm them. And if they chose to suck it up and work on the generator while exposed, not only would they risk getting down quickly, but he had add-ons that helped counter this. The add-ons that CM9I chose for going against Eternal were both the uncommon add-on called the Shotgun Speakers and the rare add-on called the Brown Noise Generator. The Shotgun Speakers suppress the sound that plays right before the skill check, basically just a 5-stack Huntress Lullaby, which doesn't sound too strong against competitive players, but combined with both the Overcharge and Oppression combo that CM was running, it had a pretty powerful synergy. Also, Oppression is a damn good choice for playing a 3-gen. If you don't know, Oppression is a perk that causes 3 other generators to start regressing when a single generator is kicked. It's pretty nasty for a setup like that. Because of Oppression, if a survivor is working on any of the 3 generators that get affected, they get a skill check. With the combined skill check difficulty, this was a really solid setup for keeping a 3-gen. The Brown Noise Generator makes it so any survivor within the drone's AoE is oblivious to the killer's terror radius, which adds an increased lethality to being exposed because of a drone. The other perks that CM ran were Eruption, of course, and Sloppy Butcher. Eruption was an obvious choice because any down he'd get would trigger Eruption on all 3 generators because he was kicking so much, and Sloppy just to make it harder for the survivors to heal quickly, despite running Circle of Healing. This is a pretty damn good build for using a 3-gen strategy, and despite the amazing communication between the players in Eternal, they were barely able to escape before an hour passed. The most annoying part is that CM didn't really have to sweat at all. Listening to Eternal's comms, they were constantly making sure they were getting as much pressure in as possible, making sure someone was always ready to take a protection hit and getting as far away as they could before someone went down. Needless to say, they were playing the best that they could in the situation they were in. CM, however, was just listening to music and playing pretty relaxed. Like I said before, there were no moments from the killer's perspective where I said to myself that was a damn good play, other than in the very beginning. The gameplay from the killer's point of view was just going back and forth to different generators, kicking them when he could, and activating drones and replacing them when need be. It was so unbelievably boring to watch. Sure, the build and map choices took some knowledge and planning to make happen, and it does show a little bit of killer knowledge and skill on CM9I's part, but when it comes to actual gameplay, there were no plays I saw that I couldn't imagine even a mediocre player doing. Just constant gen kicking and resetting the power. Sure, they managed to pull off a last minute escape and technically win, but it was such a painful process to watch that I don't even think it was worth it. Well, I guess it kind of was. You see, the private match that CM9I and Eternal played was a good thing, not because of the game itself, but the conversation the game started. Ever since Behavior gave Skull Merchant her buff, it's been pretty quiet. Many people know she's a problem, and that's why most people just DC against her as soon as they find out that's who they're going against. But in regards to big conversations about it, we've heard nothing really. CM9I being a little shit on Twitter towards Nightlight actually resulted in a game that started a conversation that we should have been having this whole time, which is that the Skull Merchant shouldn't exist in the current state she's in. I'd love to be able to suggest buffs to her and that sort of thing, but I honestly don't know what they'd be able to do to her. If they make her drones worse, she'd be the most pointless killer in the game, and no one would play her. If they buff her chase potential with her drones, then she'd just come across as annoying and uncounterable, if those changes were even good to begin with. They've obviously tried to incentivize people to chase with her more, but they didn't nerf her ability to hold generators, so it feels pointless. If people want to play a killer for their chase potential, they'll just play someone else that's actually fun. She's such an embarrassment of a killer that the only way to really fix her is to rework her power entirely. Only time will tell if Behavior chooses to take that path, but for me, as of right now, I'd consider Skull Merchant to be the biggest failure of Dead by Daylight.